In 1997, the Callahan family vanished from their quiet Long Island home. Dinner still warm on the table, doors locked from the inside, and their car gone. Weeks later, that car turned up in this very parking lot. Spotless, empty, and hiding one secret no one could explain. For decades, their disappearance remained unsolved. Tonight, we reopen the case. What really happened to the Callahans? And why did the trail lead here, to the edge of nowhere? If you're drawn to the shadows of unsolved mysteries, subscribe and stay with us, because some stories refuse to stay buried. The summer of 1997 had begun like any other on the South Shore. Heat shimmered off the blacktop of Merrick Road. Children biked to ice cream shops in packs, and the beaches filled with families hauling coolers and umbrellas through the sand. Long Island stretched out under a heavy sun, caught between suburban predictability and the restless pull of the Atlantic. Inside the Callahan home, life carried on as if nothing extraordinary could touch it. The house was modest, a two-story colonial on a quiet cul-de-sac lined with trimmed hedges and maple trees. From the outside, it looked like every other house in the neighborhood. White siding, blue shutters, a flag mounted by the front porch. Thomas Callahan was a dentist, known for his easy laugh and for slipping kids an extra sticker after a cavity filling. His wife, Elaine, worked as a paralegal at a Garden City firm, balancing work and motherhood with a rigid efficiency her friends admired. They had two children, 13-year-old Rachel, who scribbled in notebooks late into the night, and her younger brother Matthew, 9 years old, with a boundless energy that often left the neighbors' flower beds trampled. On the evening of July the 12th, the Callahans ate dinner together at the kitchen table. Roast chicken, corn on the cob, iced tea sweating in tall glasses. It was, according to Elaine's mother, the last time anyone saw them alive. The next morning, the house was silent. Too silent. Elaine's co-worker called the home phone when she didn't arrive at the office. No answer. Rachel missed her babysitting shift. Matthew's friend showed up with a baseball glove and left confused. By nightfall, the Callahan house had become a sealed chamber of questions. The roast chicken still sat on the counter, untouched. The iced tea had grown flat. Thomas's glasses lay folded on the nightstand upstairs, as if waiting for him to return. And the family's red Ford Explorer, their only car, was missing. When police arrived, they found no sign of forced entry, no struggle, no note, just absence, dense and unbearable, like a fog that seeped into every corner of the house. For weeks, detectives scoured Long Island. They interviewed neighbors, sifted through trash, combed through the Callahans' financial records. But nothing explained why 4 people could vanish without a trace. Then, on the 21st day, a break, or what seemed like one. A call came from an anonymous tipster. The red Explorer was sitting in the back of an abandoned strip mall lot near Patchogue. When police arrived, they found the car exactly as described. Inside, it was immaculate. No fingerprints beyond the family's own. No dirt, no receipts, no sign it had been driven at all. On the driver's side floor mat, however, was a single object that did not belong. A child's shoe, pink and scuffed at the toe. It wasn't Matthew's, it wasn't Rachel's, and that was where the trail stopped cold. For 20 years, the Long Island vanishings remained an open wound, unsolved, whispered about in diners, dissected on late-night radio shows. A story too chilling to forget, too incomplete to move past. But sometimes, secrets don't stay buried. They wait, and when they surface, they do so violently. The call came on a gray April morning, the kind of morning when the sky looked bruised and the sea smelled sharp with rain. Detective Laura Bennett had just sat down with her first cup of coffee when her phone buzzed. "Bennett," she answered, voice flat with routine. "This is Officer Hammond, Suffolk PD," the voice said. "We've had a discovery." Old evidence from the Callahan case just resurfaced. Bennett froze. The Callahans. She hadn't heard that name in years. Not since she joined the cold case unit. Everyone in the department knew the story. A family swallowed by the earth. Their car turning up like a ghost weeks later. "What kind of evidence?" Bennett asked. "Storage clean out over at the old Riverhead precinct," Hammond explained. "Some boxes got moved. One was mislabeled. Inside, well, it looks like items never processed. Belongings from the Explorer." Bennett's stomach knotted. Evidence misplaced for 2 decades. "Secure it," she ordered. "I'll be there in 20 minutes." Driving east along the Long Island Expressway, Bennett felt the weight of the past pressing in. She was too young to remember the vanishings firsthand, only 10 years old when they happened. But she remembered her mother locking the doors at night, whispering to neighbors about the family that had simply gone. At Riverhead, she followed Hammond down into the evidence archive. Rows of shelves stretched into darkness, stacked with cardboard boxes stamped in fading ink. Hammond stopped before one, its lid taped clumsily, the label smeared. Inside were small objects in plastic evidence bags, a hairbrush, an empty gum wrapper, a paperback novel warped from humidity, and at the bottom, wrapped in yellowing paper, a cassette tape. Bennett held it up. No case, no label. Just black plastic, unmarked except for a faint scratch across one side. "What's this doing here?" she asked. Hammond shook his head. "No record in the logs. It was found under the Explorer's passenger seat, but it looks like it never went to the lab." Bennett turned the tape over in her hand. 26 years old. If it still played, it might hold something. Or nothing. Maybe a mixtape. Maybe worse. That evening, back at her office, she borrowed an old cassette player from the records room. She pressed the tape into the slot, her pulse quickening, and pressed play. At first, only static. Then, a faint sound under the hiss. A voice. Male, distorted, whispering words too faint to catch. The static surged again, then a sharp noise like someone slamming a door, and then clear and chilling. A child's voice. Trembling. "Daddy, where are we going?" Bennett's breath caught. The tape clicked off, leaving the room hollow with silence. She sat frozen, the hair on her arms prickling. After 26 years, the Callahans were no longer just a cold case file. They were speaking again, faintly, from the dark. The next morning dawned clearer. The storm clouds from the night before swept out to sea, leaving Long Island washed in pale sunlight. But Detective Laura Bennett carried the storm with her. She hadn't slept much. The tape had replayed in her mind endlessly. The child's voice fragile, bewildered, unmoored. "Daddy, where are we going?" The question gnawed at her like a hook under the skin. She returned to the precinct early, clutching the cassette in its evidence bag. When she stepped into the cold case unit, Sergeant Frank Delgado was already at his desk, reading through an old file. Delgado was one of the few left who had been around when the Callahan family disappeared. His hair was silver now, his frame heavier, but his memory was sharp. "You look like hell," Delgado said without looking up. "I listened to it," Bennett said. His eyes lifted, narrowing. "The tape?" She nodded, setting it gently on the desk between them. Delgado leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "I always wondered what the hell happened to that box. We lost more than we admitted back then. Too much chaos, too many egos." "You knew it existed?" Bennett asked. "Rumors," Delgado admitted. "Someone said a tape was pulled from the Explorer. Nobody could find it later. Thought maybe it was just a mistake." He tapped the evidence bag. "Guess not." Bennett sat across from him, lowering her voice. "There's a child's voice on it. A boy or girl, I can't tell for sure. They say, 'Daddy, where are we going?'" Delgado closed his eyes briefly. like a man replaying old ghosts. Could be Rachel, could be Matthew, or could be somebody else's kid. That's what scares me, Bennett said. They played the tape together in a controlled environment, letting the hiss and distortion fill the cramped office. Delgado's face hardened as the child's voice rang out again. When the sound clicked off, he muttered, "Christ, that's them." "You're sure?" Bennett pressed. "As sure as I can be. That's a Callahan kid." A silence stretched between them. Outside the office, phones rang, detectives shuffled papers, but inside, time felt suspended. Finally, Delgado spoke. "You know what this means, don't you? The Callahans got into that car alive. Somebody was driving, and somebody else recorded it." Bennett's pulse quickened. So who had the tape, and why hide it? By midday, the tape had been sent to the audio lab. Analysts would attempt to clean up the static, extract background sounds, maybe identify a second voice. But Bennett wasn't content to wait. She drove to the old Callahan house in East Islip. It stood weathered but intact, owned now by a retired couple who had moved in 10 years after the disappearance. They let her inside politely, used to curious strangers knocking. The kitchen still had the same layout, the counter where the chicken had cooled, the table where iced tea glasses had sweated rings into the wood. Bennett stood there imagining the family's last meal, trying to see through the eyes of the investigators who had walked these floors in '97. Never felt right, buying a house with that history. The wife admitted softly, her hands twisting at her apron. But people said, "It's just a story. Let it go. We got a good price." Bennett nodded absently. She opened the back door, stepping into the yard. Maple trees leaned overhead, their branches skeletal in early spring. She imagined Rachel running across the grass, Matthew chasing with a baseball glove. An ordinary family, caught in an extraordinary shadow. What had lured them from this place? What convinced them to leave dinner half-eaten, possessions untouched? Her phone buzzed. The audio lab. "We've isolated more," the technician said. "There's background noise, road sounds, maybe Route 27. And after the child speaks, there's a man's voice, very faint. We boosted it. It sounds like he says, 'Almost there.'" Bennett's grip tightened on the phone. "Can you send me the file?" Minutes later, standing in the Callahan's old backyard, she listened through earbuds. The static surged, then the child's question, then, barely audible, a male voice. "Almost there." Her chest constricted. It could have been Thomas Callahan, or it could have been someone else entirely. The investigation widened quickly. Bennett pulled the original case files, combing through reports. Detectives had interviewed dozens back then, neighbors, co-workers, relatives. But one detail caught her attention. A witness had reported seeing the Explorer the night after the family vanished, parked outside a shuttered bowling alley near Ronkonkoma. The report had been buried, dismissed as unreliable. Bennett drove to the location. The bowling alley was long gone, replaced by a self-storage facility, its rows of metal doors gleaming in the sun. She stood in the lot, picturing the Explorer sitting there, engine cooling, windows reflecting neon that no longer existed. The cassette tape, the unexplained stop. Whoever had been with the Callahans was moving them deliberately, like pieces on a board. That evening, Bennett returned to her apartment in Huntington. She sat at the kitchen table surrounded by files, photographs spread like tarot cards. The Callahans smiling on a beach, the red Explorer gleaming in the driveway. Her eyes kept drifting back to Rachel, 13 years old, wide-eyed, awkward, already scribbling in journals. Bennett had been nearly the same age in '97. She remembered the news reports, the way her own mother had pulled her closer those nights. She whispered aloud, "What happened to you?" Her phone buzzed again. Delgado. "We've got something else," he said without preamble. One of the evidence bags from the Explorer contained hair. It wasn't logged properly. Lab says it's not a match for any of the Callahans. Bennett went still. Whose was it? They don't know yet. Testing's in progress, but it belonged to another child. The words hung in the air like smoke. Another child. That night, sleep refused to come. Bennett lay awake, the tape playing in her head on a loop. Daddy, where are we going? Almost there. And now, the specter of another child, unknown, unclaimed, woven into the mystery. She turned onto her side, staring into the darkness. If the Callahans had not been alone that night, then someone else's story had been swallowed with theirs. Someone who had never even been reported missing. Bennett understood, with a sudden clarity that chilled her. This case wasn't about a family vanishing into thin air. It was about a pattern, and patterns rarely stop at one. The next day unfolded in fragments, each piece darker than the last. Detective Bennett arrived early at the Suffolk County Forensic Lab, where technicians were already huddled around the results of the hair sample. The sterile, humming room smelled faintly of bleach, paper, and burnt coffee. A young technician, Alvarez, looked up from his monitor when she entered. "We've finished preliminary sequencing," he said, voice taut with the weight of revelation. "It's a child's hair, all right. Female. Around the same age as Rachel, maybe a little younger. But here's the thing. It doesn't match anyone in the Callahan family tree. We cross-referenced with available databases. No direct hit." "No missing person report?" Bennett pressed. "None that we can find. At least not one tied to Long Island in that window." The words sank into her like stones. Another girl, present in that explorer. Unrecorded by history. Delgado joined her in the lab, tugging at his tie like he always did when the room felt too tight. "If we can't match her," he said, "then either she was never reported missing, or someone buried her paperwork." The thought chilled them both. By mid-afternoon, Bennett and Delgado were at the County Records Archive, a brutalist concrete building that held the paper skeletons of thousands of lives. They sifted through files of missing children from the 1990s, faded Polaroids, photocopied reports, frantic notes scrawled in margins. One pattern emerged. Several cases of young girls gone missing from poor neighborhoods across Queens and Brooklyn in the early 90s. Many were never followed up with vigor. Families without resources. Police stretched thin. Stories lost beneath headlines of bigger crimes. Delgado spread the files across a metal table. What if our mystery girl isn't from the suburbs? What if she was already invisible before she disappeared? Bennett nodded grimly, and the Callahans stumbled into her orbit. That evening, Bennett drove to Queens. She visited a woman named Angela Morales, whose daughter Maribel had gone missing in 1995, 2 years before the Callahans vanished. Angela's apartment was small, walls crowded with framed photos of the girl smiling in school portraits. Angela greeted her cautiously, suspicion hardened by decades of disappointment. "Cops never cared about my Maribel," she said bitterly. "Said she was probably a runaway. She was 12. She was a baby." Bennett spoke gently. "We found evidence in another case, a child's hair. We don't know if it's Maribel's, but it's possible. Would you be willing to give a DNA sample for comparison?" Angela's eyes welled, anger and hope colliding in her face. "If there's even a chance, yes." She held out her arm without hesitation. As the swab was taken, Bennett glanced again at the photos. A detail lodged in her mind. Maribel had worn a pair of pink sneakers in one image, scuffed at the toe, the same kind of shoe found in the Explorer. Driving back along the Long Island Expressway, dusk fell in a wash of orange and violet. Bennett's phone buzzed with a text from Alvarez. "DNA swab received. Running tests now. Results tomorrow." She placed the phone face down on the passenger seat, knuckles tightening around the wheel. If Maribel's hair was in the Callahan car, the story shifted drastically. It meant the vanishings were never isolated. They were part of something larger. 2 families intersecting, one erased from memory, the other remembered only through whispers. and it meant someone had engineered both disappearances. Delgado insisted they revisit the Explorer itself. The vehicle had been stored for decades in a police impound lot, gathering dust under tarps. At nightfall, they stood beneath fluorescent lights in the cavernous storage bay. The SUV's red paint was dull, metal pitted with rust, but it radiated the weight of everything it had carried. They walked around it slowly, flashlights slicing through shadows. Delgado crouched at the driver's side door. The car was detailed when they found it. Wiped down, too clean. Whoever ditched it knew what they were doing. Bennett opened the back hatch. The smell of old upholstery and mildew drifted out. She ran her hand along the carpet, feeling for irregularities. Her fingers brushed against a seam, something loose beneath the lining. With effort, she pulled back the carpet. A compartment, crudely cut, revealed itself. Inside, wedged deep, was a scrap of fabric. She lifted it with tweezers into the light. It was pale blue, patterned faintly with cartoon characters. Children's pajamas. Delgado exhaled through his teeth. "That doesn't belong to any Callahan kid." Bennett's voice was steady, but her throat tightened. "That makes 2 children unaccounted for." They logged the evidence and left the bay in silence. Outside, the night was cold, the stars sharp pinpricks over the dark stretch of Long Island. Bennett leaned against her car, staring at the constellations. Each new piece of evidence felt like a thread, unraveling a tapestry she hadn't known existed. "Frank," she said softly, "what if this wasn't random? What if the Callahans were taken because they saw too much? Because they intersected with whoever had that girl?" Delgado's face was grave. "Then we're not chasing ghosts. We're chasing someone who hunted families." The words lodged in the air, too heavy to move. Bennett looked east, toward the empty highways, the forgotten lots, the strip malls where weeds cracked asphalt. Somewhere in that sprawl, the truth had been buried. But truths, like bones, had a way of surfacing when the ground shifted, and she could feel the ground starting to shift. The morning after the fabric was recovered from the Explorer, the results from the lab came in. Detective Bennett sat at her desk, fingers drumming against a styrofoam coffee cup gone cold. The email notification blinked on her screen. DNA comparison. Morales case. She opened it with her breath caught high in her chest. Sample hair. Positive match to maternal DNA. Subject, Maribel Morales. Bennett leaned back slowly, pulse thrumming in her ears. She read it again to be sure, then a third time. There was no doubt. The hair in the Explorer belonged to a child who had vanished 2 years before the Callahans. Delgado appeared in the doorway, chewing on a toothpick. "Well?" Bennett swiveled the monitor toward him. He read in silence, his brow furrowing deeper. Then he removed the toothpick and muttered, "Jesus." Maribel had been there, in that car. But how? They drove to Queens that afternoon, back to Angela Morales. The woman answered the door with a guarded expression, hope and fear warring behind her eyes. "Do you know something?" she demanded before Bennett could even speak. Bennett's voice was careful, but steady. "We confirmed the hair we found. It belongs to Maribel." Angela's knees buckled slightly, and she gripped the door frame. Tears welled but did not fall. She was with them, with that family. What does that mean? "It means she was alive at least until 1997, Bennett said gently. "But we don't yet know how the Callahans and your daughter crossed paths." Angela shook her head, her grief spilling into anger. "They told me she ran away, that she probably went with friends. They never looked." Bennett wanted to apologize for decades of neglect, but the words would sound hollow. Instead, she said, "We're looking now." Back in the car, Delgado tapped the steering wheel thoughtfully. "This changes everything. The Callahans weren't just a family vanishing. They were part of a chain. A chain with missing links," Bennett added. They sat in silence a moment, traffic crawling on the Grand Central Parkway. Bennett felt the press of unanswered questions. Had the Callahans tried to help Maribel? Had they stumbled onto her abduction? Or were they all victims of the same predator? That night, Bennett reviewed the old police interviews again. Most were routine. Co-workers, teachers, neighbors. But one detail, overlooked in the haze of '97, snagged her attention. A neighbor had mentioned seeing a man near the Callahan house the night before they disappeared. A stranger, tall, wearing a baseball cap pulled low. He had lingered by the street lamp, smoking, watching the house. The report had been dismissed. Too vague. Bennett traced the notes. The neighbor had described the man's car, a dark sedan, older model, with a dent in the rear bumper. She dug deeper, cross-referencing vehicle registrations from that year. One possible match surfaced, a 1985 Oldsmobile, registered to a man named Harold Hal Mercer. Mercer. The name meant nothing at first, but as she typed it into the database, old records flickered up. A string of arrests for petty theft, disorderly conduct, and one charge of unlawful restraint in 1989, dismissed due to lack of evidence. Her pulse quickened. The next morning, Bennett and Delgado knocked on a door in a sagging row house in Hempstead. The man who answered was gaunt, his hair thin, his eyes watery but sharp. He leaned on the door frame with a slight tremor in his hand. "Hal Mercer?" Bennett asked. "Yeah. Who's asking?" "Suffolk County Detectives. We'd like to ask you some questions." Mercer smirked faintly. "Haven't thought about Suffolk in years. Come in if you dare." The inside smelled of smoke and dust. A television murmured in the background, a game show host shouting over canned applause. They sat at a cluttered table. Delgado got straight to the point. "Back in 1997, you owned an Oldsmobile. Dark, dented bumper. That right?" Mercer chuckled without humor. "That heap, yeah. Drove it into the ground. And neighbors near East Islip reported seeing a man fitting your description near the Callahan house the night they disappeared." Mercer's eyes gleamed, like a man savoring attention. "Oh, the Callahans. That old ghost story. People still chasing it?" "You were there," Bennett said firmly. "Why?" Mercer leaned back, creaking the chair. "I was a repo man sometimes. That's why I was there. Wrong house, maybe? I don't remember. Been a long time." "Did you know a girl named Maribel Morales?" Bennett pressed. His expression flickered, just briefly, before the smirk returned. "Never heard of her." Bennett watched the flicker like a hawk. It was there. The recognition he didn't want to show. Delgado leaned forward, voice low. "Hal, you need to understand. Things have changed. Evidence has resurfaced. We're not asking. We're going to find out what happened. If you had nothing to do with it, now's your chance to say so." Mercer tapped ash from an invisible cigarette. "Detective, you'll find ghosts if you keep digging, but sometimes ghosts don't like being found." The words chilled the room. As they left, Delgado muttered, "That guy's dirty." You could smell it. Bennett nodded, but unease knotted her stomach. Mercer was taunting them, dangling half-truths. But was he the architect, or just a shadow orbiting the real predator? That night, she replayed the cassette tape once more. Static. The child's trembling question. "Daddy? Where are we going?" Pause. The faint male voice. Almost there. She shut her eyes, listening for tone, for cadence, for anything. And though she couldn't prove it, the rhythm of the words carried something familiar, something like Mercer's voice. But another detail gnawed at her. If Mercer had been stalking the Callahans, and if Maribel had been with them, who was pulling the strings? One man didn't fit the scale. She wrote a single word in her notebook, underlined twice. Network. The following week stretched like wire pulled taut. Each day brought more fragments, but no complete picture. The lab confirmed the pajama fabric from the Explorer carried traces of 2 DNA profiles. One matched Maribel Morales. The other was inconclusive, degraded, partial, but definitely not Callahan. Another child, another ghost. Detective Bennett pinned photographs and notes to the corkboard in her office. The Callahans in their backyard, Maribel Morales smiling in a school portrait. A scrap of fabric bagged in plastic. A grainy DMV photo of Hal Mercer, his smirk frozen in time. The board looked less like a timeline and more like a web. Delgado stepped in, carrying 2 coffees. He paused, studying the mess. "You're building a spider's nest," he said. "Feels like it," Bennett murmured. She took the cup and sipped. Lukewarm, bitter. Perfect for her mood. Delgado tapped a photo of Mercer. "That guy's the spider. Always around, never caught in the web himself." "Maybe," Bennett said, "but I think he's more of a middleman." A feeder. Delgado arched an eyebrow. "Feeding to who?" "That's what we need to find out." Their next lead came not from police records, but from a journalist. That afternoon, Bennett received a call from an unfamiliar number. The man on the line introduced himself as Daniel Royce, an independent investigative reporter. "I hear you're digging into the Callahan case again," he said, his voice low, urgent. Bennett bristled. "Where did you hear that?" "Whispers. Cold cases always attract scavengers, Detective. But I'm not a scavenger. I've been following disappearances on Long Island for 15 years. I think the Callahans are part of something bigger. If you want proof, meet me." Bennett's instinct screamed caution. "Why me?" "Because you're the only one reopening it," Royce replied. "And because I'm running out of time. People connected to this don't like loose threads." He gave her an address, a diner off Montauk Highway, the kind of place where faded booths smelled of coffee and fried eggs. That evening, Bennett and Delgado slid into a corner booth across from Royce. He was in his 40s, hair tousled, eyes ringed with exhaustion. He carried a battered leather satchel that looked like it had lived through wars. Royce didn't waste time. He spread out clippings and notes across the table, missing persons bulletins, newspaper scraps, police sketches. "Look," he said, jabbing a finger at the paper trail. "The Callahans vanished in 97, but in 94, a mother and son disappeared from Patchogue. Never solved. In 1995, Maribel Morales. In 1996, a young babysitter in Huntington. And then the Callahans, all within a 40-mile radius, all near highways, all families or children with no protection." Delgado frowned. "That's a lot of dots. You sure they connect?" Royce met his eyes. "They don't just connect. They form a pattern. The families didn't just vanish, they were taken. Someone orchestrated it. Someone who knew how to erase people." Bennett studied him carefully. "What makes you so sure?" Royce reached into his satchel and produced a photograph. It was grainy, taken from a distance. A man with a baseball cap, tall, leaning against a dark sedan with a dented bumper. Hal Mercer. "This photo was taken outside a motel near Riverhead in 96, Royce said. "The same week the babysitter vanished. Mercer's been circling these families like a vulture for decades, but he's not the one running the show. He works for someone else." "Who?" Bennett asked. Royce hesitated, lowering his voice. "There's a name that keeps surfacing in whispers. Charlie Carnes. He used to run salvage yards, odd jobs, shady construction crews, always hiring drifters, men who needed money fast. And kids went missing around the places he worked. But no one pinned him. Too slippery. Too protected." Delgado leaned back. "Protected by who?" Royce's eyes flicked around the diner nervously. "That's the problem. Carnes wasn't just some thug. He had friends in law enforcement. He had money from people who wanted certain things supplied. You follow me?" The silence that followed was heavy. Bennett's stomach turned. She thought of the erased evidence box, the missing tape, the pajama scrap overlooked for decades. Had this case been buried on purpose? "Why come to us now?" she asked. Royce's face tightened. "Because 2 nights ago, someone broke into my apartment, took my hard drives, my files. They wanted me quiet. I think I've only got days before I disappear too." Driving back from the diner, the night pressing in around them, Delgado muttered, "You think this guy's paranoid or telling the truth?" Bennett stared out at the highway, headlights slicing through darkness. "Paranoia doesn't make photos appear in your lap. If he's right, we're not dealing with one missing family. We're dealing with a system built to make families disappear." Delgado's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "Then we just kicked the hornet's nest." That night, Bennett couldn't sleep again. She sat at her kitchen table, the cassette tape beside her, the corkboard photo web in front of her. The fragments felt like voices whispering in the dark. Rachel Callahan's diary, recovered from her room in '97, lay open. Most entries were typical: friends, school, songs she liked. But the last one, written the day before they vanished, sent a chill through her bones. "Saw the man in the car again tonight. He was parked near the streetlight. Dad said it's nothing, but I don't like it. He looks at our house too long." The man with the car. The man Rachel feared. Hal Mercer. The next morning, Mercer was gone. His neighbors reported he'd packed a single bag, left in the middle of the night. His car remained in the driveway, but the house was empty. Delgado slammed the file down. He bolted. Someone tipped him. Bennett's voice was steady, but her blood ran cold. Or someone pulled his leash. Either way, the Callahan case had cracked open into something wider, darker, and far more dangerous than she had imagined. And in her gut, she knew. This wasn't just an old case being solved. This was a door being opened, and what lay on the other side was watching them already. Hal Mercer's sudden disappearance sent ripples through the investigation like a rock dropped in still water. Detective Bennett and Sergeant Delgado stood inside Mercer's row house that morning, watching crime scene techs sift through the debris of his life. The air smelled of dust and nicotine. The walls stained a tired yellow. The television was still on, tuned to a static-filled channel, as if Mercer had walked away mid-breath. "Looks staged," Delgado muttered, hands on his hips. "Guy doesn't just leave the TV running unless he wants us to think he left in a hurry." Bennett walked through the narrow hallways. The bedroom closet was mostly empty except for wire hangers clinking together. Drawers had been pulled out, contents dumped in careless heaps. But she didn't buy it. Mercer wasn't panicked. He was plucked. She crouched beside the nightstand. In the drawer, she found a small notebook, the cover smudged with ash. Flipping it open, she found half-legible scrawls. Dates, initials, locations. One entry caught her eye. Emma Morales, 95, Safe House, Ronkonkoma. Her pulse quickened. Delgado leaned over her shoulder. "That's it. Proof he had Maribel. Safe House, wipe my ass." Another line read, "See? All clear. Move them next week." Bennett circled it with her pen. "See, that could be Carnes." Delgado grunted. "Looks like our friend Hal wasn't just a drifter, he was keeping records." By afternoon, they were in Ronkonkoma, canvassing old addresses. Mercer's notebook listed a specific cross street, near a strip of motels and warehouses long abandoned. The Safe House was a 2-story rental, boarded up, weeds clutching at the siding. A faded for sale sign tilted in the yard. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with mildew. Graffiti scrawled across cracked plaster. But upstairs, in the back bedroom, Bennett found something that stilled her heart. A child's drawing taped to the wall, its paper brittle with age. Crayon figures, stick people holding hands beneath a bright sun. 4 figures, a man, a woman, 2 children. In uneven letters, scrawled at the bottom, "Maribel plus mommy plus daddy plus me." Delgado exhaled sharply. She was here. Bennett's throat tightened. The drawing was a fossil of innocence, left behind in a place that had held only shadows. She peeled the paper from the wall carefully, sliding it into an evidence folder. We need every fingerprint, every fiber in this house. The crime scene team moved in, dusting surfaces. Minutes later, a tech called out, "We've got something. Partial print on the window frame, still viable." When the results came back that evening, Bennett's heart lurched. The fingerprint belonged to Rachel Callahan. That night, Bennett sat alone in her apartment with the evidence spread across her table. Maribel's hair, the pajama fabric, Rachel's fingerprint in the safe house. The Callahans hadn't just crossed paths with Maribel. They had been in the same prison. The tape replayed in her head, its voices sharpened now with dreadful clarity. "Daddy, where are we going?" Almost there. Almost where? The safe house. She scribbled in her notebook. They were moved. The next morning, Delgado brought fresh intel. Ran background on Carnes. Guy's rap sheet is thick with everything but murder, assault, illegal weapons, extortion. Always walked. Always some judge looking the other way. And guess what? In 1997, he owned property out near Riverhead. A salvage yard. Bennett's stomach turned. Like Royce said. "Yeah," Delgado said grimly. "And guess what's next door to that salvage yard? Woods, miles of it. Perfect place to bury secrets." They drove out that afternoon. The salvage yard was still there, though under new ownership. Rusted hulks of cars stacked like tombstones, dogs barking from cages. The current manager, a wary man with oil-stained hands, said Carnes sold the place years ago. "Shady business?" he muttered. "Guy creeped everyone out. Never stayed in one place long." Bennett and Delgado walked the perimeter. Weeds, trash, twisted metal. And, beyond the fence, dense wood stretching into silence. Bennett felt it in her bones. Something was out there. The search began the next day, cadaver dogs weaving through underbrush, their handlers patient, methodical. The ground was soft, still thawing from winter. Shovels pierced earth at flagged sites. Hours passed. Then one dog stiffened, pawing frantically at a shallow depression near the tree line. The handler called out. Bennett and Delgado approached as the team dug carefully. 6 inches down, the shovel struck something hard. A fragment of bone, small, fragile. The site was widened. More bone surfaced, discolored by decades. Not a complete skeleton, pieces scattered. But enough to know. One child, maybe more. Delgado swore under his breath. "We just found the graveyard." Bennett's throat locked. Her eyes burned as she whispered, "How many families?" By dusk, the woods glowed with floodlights, the hum of generators filling the air. Evidence bags lined the tables, bones catalogued with grim precision. Bennett stood at the edge of the site, staring into the dark beyond the lights. The weight of it pressed down on her like the earth itself. This wasn't one disappearance, not even two. This was an industry. She whispered to herself. The Long Island vanishings weren't random. They were systematic. And somewhere Charlie Carnes was still alive, still out there, still watching. The bones from Riverhead shifted the case from an old cold file to an active nightmare. Within 24 hours, Suffolk County announced a multi-agency task force. Detectives who had once mocked the Callahan file as a ghost hunt were suddenly crowding Bennett's office, eager to be part of the dig. News vans lined the perimeter of the salvage yard, their lights flashing across the rusted carcasses of cars. Headlines screamed, "Mass grave discovered in Long Island woods." But Bennett felt no triumph, only dread. The bones were fragments of at least 2 children and 1 adult, according to the forensic anthropologist. Identities would take weeks, maybe months. But Bennett didn't need the DNA yet to know. These were the missing, the forgotten, the ones the files had reduced to faded photocopies. The Callahans, Maribel, maybe others. In the chaos, Daniel Royce called again. His voice shook with urgency. "I told you Carnes was the center. Now you've got the graveyard. But you don't understand how deep this goes. Carnes wasn't working alone." "Then who?" Bennett demanded. There was a pause, static crackling across the line. "Meet me tonight. Jones Beach parking lot, 2 a.m. It's the only safe place. Too open for them to corner us. Daniel, slow down." But he had already hung up. 2 a.m. The parking lot stretched empty beneath a bruised sky. Waves thundered in the distance, salt wind cutting sharp. Bennett and Delgado waited in their unmarked sedan, headlights off. Royce appeared at the edge of the lot, clutching his satchel like a life raft. He hurried to the car, slid into the back seat. His face was pale, eyes darting. "They're watching me," he said. "Everywhere. I've seen the same van outside my place for days. I know they're close." "Who's they?" Delgado asked. Royce leaned forward, his breath sour with fear. Charlie Carnes was the butcher, sure, but he had clients, men with money, men who wanted access. He supplied. They protected him. That's why the files vanished. That's why Mercer was never arrested. The network went higher. Judges, cops, businessmen, they were all in on it. Bennett felt her stomach twist. "You're saying this wasn't just abduction. This was organized." Royce nodded frantically. "And Carnes kept records. Blackmail, leverage. Somewhere he's got files, tapes, proof. That's why he's never been caught. Anyone who tries ends up—" He froze, eyes widening. Headlights swept the lot. A van rolled slowly toward them. Royce's breath hitched. "That's them." Delgado's hand went to his holster. "Stay calm." The van paused 30 feet away, idling. The windows were blacked out. Then, with a screech, it peeled away, tires spitting gravel, vanishing into the night. Royce sagged in the back seat, trembling. "They wanted to remind me. They're always there." Bennett exchanged a look with Delgado. The paranoia sounded wild, until the van appeared. She turned to Royce. "If Carnes has records, where?" Royce swallowed. "He had a farmhouse once, out past Yafank. Rumors said it wasn't just a house, it was a holding site. If anything survived, it'll be there." The next morning, Bennett pulled property records. Sure enough, a farmhouse once deeded to Carnes had burned down in 2002. Cause, electrical fault. But the land remained in his name. By noon, she and Delgado were there. The farmhouse was nothing but charred beams and collapsed roof lines. Vines strangled the foundation. A scorched mailbox still bore the number in faded paint. Bennett stepped through the ruins, ash crunching underfoot. Delgado poked at the rubble with a stick. "Convenient fire, don't you think?" "Too convenient," Bennett murmured. A crime scene tech joined them, scanning with a metal detector. Minutes later, it beeped near what had once been a basement stairwell. They dug carefully, revealing a warped metal box, blackened but intact. Inside, wrapped in melted plastic, were reels of videotape. Bennett stared, heart hammering. Delgado Sussurro. Jesus. He filmed it. That evening, in the lab, technicians worked to salvage the tapes. The images were degraded, but some frames survived. The grainy footage showed children in a dim room, forced to sit in a line. A man's shadow moved across the frame, unmistakably broad, hulking. His face never clear, but his voice carried. A low rasp. Bennett froze as the sound hissed through the speakers. The voice was the same one from the cassette tape. Almost there, Charlie Carnes. Later, Bennett sat in her car, the night pressing close. She could still hear that rasp in her ears. Delgado leaned against the hood, staring at the sky. "We've got him. His voice, his house, his tapes. This is it." Bennett shook her head slowly. "Not yet. If Royce is right, the tapes are leverage. If Carnes has more, if he still has clients in power." Delgado finished for her. "They'll protect him." The ocean wind carried distant sirens. Bennett whispered, almost to herself, "Then we're not just hunting Carnes." She looked at the horizon, dark waves crashing. "We're hunting everyone who let him exist." The discovery of the tapes broke the story wide open. News outlets ran headlines about a possible Long Island predator. Families of the missing flooded the precinct with calls, voices shaking with decades of pain. Could my daughter be on those tapes? Could my son have been there? Bennett couldn't give answers. Not yet. The Attorney General's office seized jurisdiction within days. Politicians postured at press conferences, promising swift justice. But Bennett noticed how quickly the language shifted, from systematic abductions to possible lone predator. The network Royce had warned them about was already erasing itself from the narrative. Delgado slammed the morning paper onto his desk. They're sanitizing it, turning Carnes into some bogeyman acting alone. No word about Mercer or the bones in Riverhead. Bennett rubbed her temples. If we don't move fast, Carnes will disappear again. Or worse, they'll let him slip through. Royce returned to the precinct 2 days later, drawn and haggard. He carried new photos, grainy black and whites. Taken in the late 90s, he explained, spreading them across the table. The photos showed Carnes at a bar, flanked by men in suits. One of them was a Judge Bennett recognized from an old corruption probe. Another was a retired police captain. Clients, Royce whispered. He wasn't just feeding his own sickness. He was supplying others. Delgado swore softly. We put this out, and half the city goes up in flames. Bennett stared at the images, bile rising in her throat. These weren't shadows anymore. They were faces, names, men who had shaken hands at ribbon cuttings, who had smiled in holiday parades, predators hiding in daylight. That night, Bennett drove alone to Mercer's old row house. The crime scene tape fluttered in the cold wind. She sat in her car, staring at the darkened windows. Her gut told her Mercer hadn't fled willingly. Someone had cleaned him off the board. As she sat there, a figure moved in the shadows down the block. A man in a hooded jacket, standing too still. Watching, her pulse surged. She flicked her headlights on, but when the beam cut across the street, the figure was gone. She sat gripping the wheel, breath sharp. Was it her nerves, or had someone just sent a message? The tapes were sent for digital restoration. Weeks later, new images emerged. In one frame, a family sat at a kitchen table. The mother's eyes swollen from crying, the father rigid, his hand clamped over his daughter's shoulder. The grain blurred details, but Bennett recognized the girl instantly. Rachel Callahan. Her stomach turned to ice. The Callahans had not simply vanished. They had been filmed, catalogued. The next frame showed Carnes entering the room. His hulking outline filled the doorway. He placed a hand on Rachel's head, almost gentle, before leading her from the room. The tape ended there. Bennett had to excuse herself from the lab. In the hallway, she pressed her forehead against the cool wall, forcing her breath steady. She had seen crime, cruelty, horror. But this was different. This was theater. Staged for someone's consumption, a family's suffering commodified. Delgado found her minutes later. His voice was low, weighted. We can't bury this. They'll try, but we can't. Bennett lifted her head, eyes red. Then we don't play by their rules. Delgado's brow furrowed. You're suggesting, what, going rogue? I'm suggesting we find Carnes ourselves, she said, before he disappears into another shadow. They started with property records. Though most of Carnes's assets had been liquidated, a shell company still paid taxes on a lakeside cabin upstate near the Catskills. Officially, it belonged to Northeast Salvage LLC. Unofficially, the trail led back to him. Royce joined them in the unmarked car on the long drive north. The road wound through dense pines, snow crunching under tires. The air was brittle, the sky low and gray. As they neared the lake, Royce spoke softly from the back seat. If he's there, you'll need to be careful. He doesn't live like normal people. He builds traps around himself, loyal men, broken men who owe him. Bennett adjusted her grip on the wheel. We've seen his kind before. Royce shook his head. Not like Carnes. He survived because people underestimate him. He's not just brutal, he's patient. He waits until you think you're safe. Then he takes everything. They parked half a mile from the cabin, approaching on foot through the trees. The structure emerged slowly, hunched against the shoreline. Weathered wood, smoke rising faintly from a chimney. Through binoculars, Bennett counted 2 men on the porch, rifles slung casually. Inside, a hulking figure moved past the window, his shadow unmistakable. Charlie Carnes. The sight of him sent a jolt through her chest. He was real, flesh and blood. Delgado whispered, "We should call backup." But Bennett shook her head. "By the time they come, he'll be gone." Royce's voice cracked behind them. "If you go in there unprepared, you might never come out." Bennett kept her eyes on the cabin, her jaw tight. "Then we prepare." That night, back in their motel, Bennett spread maps and photographs across the bedspread. Every fiber in her body screamed caution, but another voice, deeper, insisted this was the only chance. Delgado paced, restless. "We need warrants. We need a task force. This isn't a drug bust. This is Carnes." Bennett looked up at him. "You think the people who buried this case for 20 years will suddenly grow spines? If we wait, he disappears again. We saw him, Delgado. He's there, breathing, watching. We may never get that close again." The room fell into tense silence. Finally, Delgado muttered, "If we do this, we do it clean. No cowboy stunts." Bennett nodded, though in her gut she knew nothing about this would be clean. The next morning, Royce knocked on their door, pale with fresh terror. "He knows. He knows you're here." Bennett's blood chilled. "How?" Royce's voice dropped to a whisper. "Because someone in your department told him." The motel room felt suddenly too small, too bright. Daniel Royce stood in the doorway, breath clouding in the cold morning air, his words hanging heavy. "Because someone in your department told him." Detective Bennett rose slowly from the table. "You're saying Carnes has an inside source?" Royce's eyes darted between her and Delgado. "I'm saying he's always had one. How else do you think he stayed ahead for decades? Someone feeds him. Someone high enough to bury reports, erase tapes, make evidence vanish." Delgado's jaw tightened. "Name?" Royce shook his head. "I don't have one. Not yet. But I've been tracing patterns. Files that went missing, cases that collapsed. There's a signature. Same hand sweeping the pieces off the board every time." Bennett exhaled, steadying herself. The thought of betrayal from within wasn't new, but now it pressed close, suffocating. "We don't have time for ghosts," Delgado snapped. "If Carnes knows we're here, he'll move." Royce's voice cracked. "Then he's already moving." They returned to the tree line overlooking the cabin that afternoon. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. The porch was empty. Bennett crouched low, binoculars raised. The front door was ajar, shifting slightly in the wind. "Too quiet," Delgado muttered. The woods pressed silent around them, snow muffling sound. No birds, no dogs, no human presence. "He's gone," Royce whispered. Bennett's chest tightened. Every instinct screamed trap. Still, they advanced cautiously, weapons drawn. The cabin loomed larger with each step, its windows dark, its angles sharp against the white. Delgado kicked the door fully open. Inside, silence. The main room reeked of smoke and stale meat. A fire still smoldered in the hearth, logs collapsing in on themselves. A duffel bag lay discarded on the floor, half-zipped, stuffed with clothing. "He left in a hurry," Delgado said. "No," Bennett murmured. She studied the room carefully. Half-packed bag, dishes still on the table, chair knocked over. "He wanted us to think he left in a hurry." The basement door groaned when they opened it. A narrow staircase led down into darkness. Bennett flicked on her flashlight. Concrete walls, damp and sweating. Shelves lined with rusted tools. Jars of nails, coils of wire. and at the far end, a heavy steel door bolted shut. Her pulse spiked. Delgado tested the handle. Locked. Royce's voice was barely audible. That's where he kept them. Bennett crouched, examining the bolt. Fresh scratches gleamed in the metal, as if unlocked and relocked recently. "Get the crowbar," she said. Delgado pried the bolt until it screamed, metal warping. The door gave with a hollow clang. Inside was a narrow room, its air stale with mold. Cots lined the walls, stained mattresses piled with filthy blankets. Chains bolted to the floor. A single bulb hung overhead, swaying gently as if someone had brushed past it moments ago. Bennett's breath caught. The air still carried heat. "They were here," she whispered. On the far wall, etched in uneven lines, were names, scratched into plaster with desperate fingers. Rachel, Maribel, TJ 1996, Anna. Bennett traced the grooves with trembling hands. These weren't files or theories. These were the voices of the vanished, carved into stone. Delgado swore softly. "This is it. This is the proof." A sharp click echoed behind them. They spun, weapons raised. At the top of the stairs, a figure stood in silhouette. Broad shoulders, thick frame, Charlie Carnes. The light caught his face just enough, weathered skin, graying beard, eyes like ice. "Well," Carnes rasped, his voice the same as the tapes. "Look at you. Bloodhounds finally found the scent." Bennett's pulse hammered. "Charlie Carnes, you're under arrest." His laugh rumbled low. "You think this is your house now? You don't even know who owns it." He stepped down one stair, boots heavy. "You're in my cellar, breathing my air. You won't leave here unless I say." Delgado raised his gun higher. "One more step, Carnes, and—" A deafening crack split the air. The bulb overhead shattered, plunging them into darkness. Gunfire erupted, blind flashes strobing the room. Wood splintered, plaster rained. Bennett dove behind the cots, heart slamming. Delgado shouted, "Royce, get down!" Another shot roared. Royce screamed. Bennett fired toward the stairs, muzzle flash briefly illuminating Carnes' silhouette retreating. Then silence. Her breath rasped in the black. "Delgado?" "Here," his voice answered. "Royce?" No reply. She scrambled across the floor, finding Royce crumpled against the wall. Blood soaked his shirt, his satchel spilled open, papers strewn across the concrete. He wheezed, eyes wide. "He knew!" His fingers twitched toward the satchel. "The files! Don't let them—" His chest stilled. Bennett froze, grief slamming into her, but footsteps above snapped her back. Carnes was gone. They stumbled from the basement into the cold air, weapons sweeping. The snow carried fresh tracks leading into the woods. "Back up now!" Delgado barked into his radio. But Bennett already knew. By the time units arrived, Carnes would be smoke, a shadow sliding through trees, vanishing as he always had. She stood on the porch, chest heaving, staring into the dark. Royce's blood still on her hands. Carnes had looked her in the eye, had laughed at her, had walked away alive, and the network that protected him was still intact. That night, Bennett sat alone in her motel room, Royce's satchel on the table. Inside were his files, photographs, notes, maps of disappearances. One folder was labeled in his shaky handwriting, "The Ones Who Paid." She opened it. Faces stared back, judges, lawyers, businessmen, some still in power. And in the middle of the page, circled in red ink, one name she recognized instantly. A decorated officer, retired, former Suffolk County Police Chief, her own department. The motel room stank of blood and mildew. Royce's satchel spread across the bed. Bennett sat frozen, the folder open in front of her. The name circled in red ink glared like a wound. Chief Walter Haynes, decorated, revered, retired with honors. The kind of man who shook hands at county fairs, who'd posed for photos with school children in front of squad cars, and according to Royce, one of the men who had paid, Bennett's stomach roiled. For years, she had trusted the system enough to believe corruption lived in dark corners, not at the very top. But now, Chief Haynes, a man whose portrait still hung in the precinct lobby. She closed the folder and pressed her palms hard against her face. If she said this out loud, her career was over. Maybe her life too. Delgado entered quietly, shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He glanced at the satchel, then at her. "You found something." Bennett slid the folder across the bed. His eyes scanned the contents, his jaw tightening. "Jesus Christ, this is the kind of thing that gets people buried." She nodded. "Which means Royce was killed for it. Carnes didn't just pull the trigger, he was cleaning up for them." Delgado sat heavily on the edge of the bed. "If Haynes is in this, we can't go through official channels. Every word we say gets fed back to Carnes. We're rats in a maze." Silence stretched. The hum of the heater filled the room. Finally, Bennett whispered, "So we burn the maze." The next morning, Bennett walked into Suffolk HQ like nothing had changed. But every hallway felt different now. Every officer's glance lingered too long. Every phone call too quiet when she entered the room. She paused at the lobby, staring at the framed portraits of former chiefs. There he was, Walter Haynes, smiling. A man who had sworn to serve and protect. She imagined the same smile turned toward Carnes, sharing drinks, whispering names of vulnerable families. Her fists clenched. That afternoon, Bennett and Delgado drove out to Haynes's retirement property, a sprawling estate near Montauk, white fences and manicured lawns, too polished for a man on a cop's pension. "Paid for by blood," Delgado muttered as they parked on the shoulder. Through binoculars, Bennett studied the grounds. Haynes, older now, walked slowly with a cane, but his frame still broad, his posture proud. Beside him, a younger man carried firewood. Bennett recognized him instantly, Reed Carraway. Her pulse thundered. "He's here," Delgado swore under his breath. So Carnes's circle didn't scatter, they just consolidated. Haynes at the top, Reed running errands, Carnes in the shadows. They watched as Reed carried the firewood inside. Haynes lingered on the porch, gazing out at the water, serene as any grandfather. Bennett whispered, "We can't arrest him on a hunch. We need hard proof." Delgado's jaw set. "Then we dig until there's nothing left to hide." That night, they broke into the cabin Carnes had abandoned. Royce's body had been removed, the evidence bagged, but the air still clung to his presence. Bennett searched the satchel again, this time slower. Hidden in the lining, she found a cassette tape labeled in shaky ink. Haynes, 1996. She slid it into the portable player they'd borrowed from evidence. The tape hissed, then voices. Carnes' rasp. Haynes's gravelly tone. "They're just kids, Charlie." "You paid for the night, Walter. Don't play pious with me." A pause. Breathing. Then Haynes again. "No one can know." "Then keep feeding me," Carnes growled. "Files, families, you stop, and I open the vault." The tape clicked off. Bennett sat trembling, the room tilting. This wasn't circumstantial anymore. This was conspiracies caught on tape. Delgado exhaled. "If we leak this, Haynes burns. The department burns. Maybe the whole damn county burns." Bennett stared at the floor. "Then we leak it." 2 nights later, the tape appeared anonymously on a true crime forum. Then on YouTube. Then the local news. By dawn, it was everywhere. Headlines screamed, "Leaked tape links retired police chief to disappearances." The precinct became a war zone. Phones rang non-stop. Officers shouted across hallways. The Attorney General announced an emergency probe. But Bennett knew chaos cut both ways. The tape might expose Haynes, but it also forced Carnes' hand. That evening, Delgado found a note taped to the windshield of his car. Plain paper, block letters. You took from me. Now I take back. CK. They tore into Bennett's apartment, searching every corner. Nothing. No sign of forced entry. But on her kitchen table, placed neatly, was a single object. A child's shoe. Blue. Her breath caught. She knew it, from the Callahan evidence box. Rachel's. Delgado's voice was tight. "He was inside your home." Bennett's hands shook as she slid the shoe into an evidence bag. The message was clear. Carnes wasn't running. He was circling. The next day, Bennett received a blocked call. She answered, heart pounding. Silence. Then the rasp she knew too well. "You like digging in my dirt, detective?" Carnes' voice slithered down the line. "Let's see how you like being buried in it." The line went dead. Bennett stood frozen, phone trembling in her hand. Charlie Carnes wasn't finished. He was hunting back. The morning after the taped threat, Bennett sat in her car outside headquarters, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles whitened. Carnes had been inside her apartment, not just watching. Inside. Delgado slid into the passenger seat, coffee in hand. "We should put you in protective custody." Bennett didn't look at him. "You know he'd just find me anyway." Delgado exhaled hard. "Then what? We wait until he decides where to hit? That's not a plan. It's suicide." Bennett turned to face him, her eyes hard. "Then we make him come to us. On our terms." That night, they staged it. The precinct leaked word, deliberate, that evidence from the cabin had been moved to a temporary safe house, a quiet property on the edge of Riverhead, unused for years, now wired with surveillance. "If he's watching us," Bennett said, "he'll hear the bait." Delgado frowned. "And if he doesn't bite?" She forced a thin smile. "Then we flush him another way." But deep inside, she knew Carnes's ego wouldn't allow silence. He needed to prove dominance. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. The safe house sat still, its windows dark. Then, movement. A figure crossed the field, hulking, shoulders heavy. He carried something long and wrapped. A weapon. Bennett's throat tightened. Through the surveillance feed, his silhouette was unmistakable. "Charlie Carnes," she whispered. They moved. Bennett, Delgado, and 2 tactical officers in black advanced from the rear. Snow crunched under boots, breaths clouded in the frigid air. Inside the safe house, Carnes kicked the door in with terrifying strength. His voice carried through the hidden mic. "Come out, little mice. Let's see your tricks." Delgado signaled. 3, 2, they breached. The room erupted in chaos. Carnes swung the wrapped weapon, a rusted crowbar, smashing a table to splinters. Officers shouted commands, red laser sights dancing. "Hands on your head," Bennett barked. Carnes turned, eyes glinting in the dim light. His grin was grotesque, teeth yellow, lips cracked. "You think cages hold me?" he rasped. He charged. The fight was brutal. Delgado fired, the bullet grazing Carnes's shoulder. He roared, swinging the crowbar. The impact knocked one officer off his feet, helmet cracking against the wall. Bennett lunged, tackling Carnes at the waist. They crashed to the floor, her gun skittering across the wood. His stench was overwhelming, sweat, smoke, decay. His hands closed around her throat, strength monstrous, squeezing until stars burst behind her eyes. "You're just another file," he hissed, "another body in my ground." Her hands scrabbled blindly, until they found the evidence bag on the floor. Inside, Rachel Callahan's tiny blue shoe. She slammed it into his face. He recoiled instinctively, grip loosening just enough. Bennett drove her knee up hard, twisting free. Delgado fired again, this time hitting Carnes square in the chest. The giant staggered, coughed, then laughed through blood. "You can't stop me," he rasped. "Not me. Not the men I fed. They'll outlive you. They'll always outlive you." He collapsed, crowbar clanging against the floor. Silence. Paramedics pronounced him dead minutes later. Bennett stood outside the safe house, snow falling soft against flashing lights. Her chest burned where his hands had crushed her throat. Delgado joined her, his face pale, clothes spattered with blood. "It's over." She shook her head slowly. Number Carnes was just the butcher. The banquet still goes on. From the shadows of the tree line, reporters' cameras flashed. The story would break by dawn. Alleged predator Charlie Carnes killed in shootout. The headlines would paint closure. But Bennett knew better. Somewhere, men in suits were already breathing easier, pouring whiskey, whispering, "One less liability." And in the dark, the names carved into that basement wall still cried out for truth. The next day, Haynes's estate was surrounded by federal agents. He was arrested without resistance, his cane tapping softly as they led him into a black SUV. The image hit every network. The smiling former chief, now handcuffed, his legacy collapsing in public view. But Bennett felt no satisfaction. She had seen the tapes. She had seen the reach. For every Haynes, there were 10 others still unnamed. Late that evening, Bennett drove alone to the shore. The ocean spread black and endless, waves chewing at the sand. She carried Rachel Callahan's shoe, holding it gently in her hands. She whispered into the night, "We found him, but I'm sorry. We didn't find you." The wind carried the words away, scattering them into the dark. Back at the motel, Delgado waited with files spread across the table. "The AG wants us in Albany tomorrow. They're building cases. They want every detail we've got." Bennett sat opposite him, staring at the papers. The satchel still bulged with names, faces, threads Royce had pulled together before he died. Her voice was quiet. "Do you ever wonder if the truth is too big to survive daylight?" Delgado looked at her for a long moment. "Then we drag it into daylight anyway, 1 inch at a time." Bennett closed her eyes, the rasp of Carnes's voice still echoing in her skull. Almost there. The morning after Carnes's death, the courthouse lawn was a frenzy of cameras. Reporters shouted, microphones thrust forward, lenses flashing. "Detective Bennett, do you believe Charlie Carnes acted alone? Were there other officers involved? Is this the end of the Long Island vanishings?" Bennett kept her face neutral, walking past with Delgado at her side. Inside, the federal task force had transformed the old Suffolk precinct into a command hub. Maps lined the walls, pins marking disappearances spanning decades. An agent briefed them briskly. "Haynes has been charged with conspiracy, obstruction, and child endangerment. Bail denied, but the DA is nervous about proceeding. Too much contamination, too many missing files." Bennett's jaw tightened. "Convenient." The agent didn't flinch. "And there's more. Several names in Royce's files, they're untouchable. State senators, judges. If we indict them without airtight evidence, the case collapses." Delgado muttered, "Which is exactly what they want." 2 weeks later, Bennett sat in a federal courtroom, watching Haynes behind the glass of the defendant's box. He looked older, smaller, his cane resting against the bench. When asked to enter a plea, his voice rasped. "Not guilty." The word sent a chill through her. Even in disgrace, he clung to denial, his face unreadable. During recess, a junior prosecutor approached Bennett in the hallway. "Off the record, Washington wants this quiet. Haynes will take a plea. 30 years, no trial." Bennett's stomach dropped. 30 years, after everything? The prosecutor lowered her eyes. "Sometimes the bigger picture demands compromise." Compromise. The word curdled in Bennett's gut. A polite way to say cover-up. Delgado found her outside smoking, his hands shaking slightly. "They're gonna bury half of it, aren't they?" he said. Bennett didn't answer. The truth was too heavy. Instead, she stared at the courthouse dome, gleaming under winter sun. "Then we don't let them," she finally said. That evening, they met with families of the vanished at a church basement in Huntington. Faces lined the folding chairs. Mothers, fathers, siblings. Decades of grief etched deep. Bennett stood at the front, holding Rachel Callahan's blue shoe. Her voice wavered but steadied. "We can't promise every answer, but we can promise this. Carnes is gone. Haynes will never walk free again. And we will keep digging until every name, every accomplice, sees daylight." Silence. Then, slowly, applause. Not joyous, never joyous, but resolute. The families deserved more than silence. They deserved memory. In the weeks that followed, fragments emerged. Search teams uncovered human remains in a wooded sinkhole near Marble Falls. Dental records confirmed what Margaret Callahan had always feared: her husband, Jim. The press ran with it. First victim of Long Island vanishings identified. Bennett attended the burial quietly, standing apart as the family wept. Closure, they called it. But she knew closure was a myth. Spring thaw brought new horrors. A fisherman pulled up a rusted lockbox from Lake Ronkonkoma. Inside, photographs, dozens of them. Children smiling awkwardly at birthday parties, teenagers at school dances, each face circled in red ink. Future prey. Many had survived into adulthood, but others were already gone. Bennett stared at the photos in evidence. The scope of it was almost beyond comprehension. Carnes had been meticulous, organized, supplied. This wasn't a monster working alone. This was a system. One night, Bennett returned home to find an envelope taped to her door. No address, no stamp. Inside, a single Polaroid. Her, walking to her car outside the precinct. On the back, scrawled in black marker, "Some doors you don't open." Her throat constricted. Carnes was dead. But the network lived on. Delgado came over immediately, pacing her kitchen. "We leak more, all of it. Royce's files, the photos, the names, force their hand." Bennett shook her head. "If we dump it recklessly, they'll discredit us, call it conspiracy, smear Royce as unstable. We need strategy, not desperation." Delgado's voice was raw. "What about survival? Because this—" He pointed at the Polaroid. "This means they're still watching." Bennett looked at the photo again, her own image staring back at her. She whispered, "Then let them watch." Weeks stretched into months. Trials dragged on. Media frenzies ebbed and spiked. Some suspects faced charges. Others vanished quietly from public view, cushioned by influence. But Bennett refused to stop. She filed new subpoenas. She pressed witnesses. She sat with families, collecting testimonies. Piece by piece, she built a mosaic of the truth. It was ugly, imperfect, full of gaps, but it was something. Late one night, sitting alone in her office, she reopened Royce's satchel. At the bottom lay one final scrap of paper, folded tight. A handwritten note in his spidery script. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it. Remember? Charlie was the blade. But blades get dull. Look for the hand that swung it. That's where the truth lives." Bennett read it twice, then tucked it back. She leaned back in her chair, exhaustion sinking deep into her bones. Carnes was gone. Haynes was behind bars. But the hand that swung the blade, the men who built the banquet, still moved unseen, and she knew she would never stop chasing them. Years later, the ocean still called her back. Detective Margaret Bennett, older now, streaks of silver through her dark hair, stood on the Long Island shore, the wind sharp with salt. The water was gray, endless, swallowing the horizon the way it had swallowed the lives she'd chased across half her career. She carried no badge anymore. Retirement had been less a choice than an inevitability. After the trials, after the press, after the politics had chewed her name to shreds, there was nothing left to give except silence. But she still came here, to the water. A memorial stood on the bluff now, names etched into granite, families gathering each year to lay flowers. Rachel Callahan, Maribel Torres, T.J. Mercer, Anna Lavoie, and so many more. She traced the letters with her fingers, the stone cold against her skin. Some families had found answers, others never would. The headlines had long faded. The networks had moved on to fresher tragedies. But for those who lived here, for mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, the Long Island vanishings were never just a story. They were an open wound. And for Bennett, they were a ghost that would never leave. She walked down to the shore, the tide creeping up to meet her boots. From her coat pocket, she drew a small object, worn and faded from years of keeping. Rachel Callahan's blue shoe. Evidence once, memory now. She held it to her chest for a long moment, then placed it gently on the sand. The tide reached for it, foam curling around the rubber sole, tugging, pulling. When the water finally carried it away, Bennett whispered into the wind, "You're not forgotten. None of you are forgotten." The sea swallowed the shoe whole. Back at her car, she found an envelope tucked beneath the wiper blade. Her stomach clenched with an old reflex, a spark of dread. Inside, a photograph. It showed the memorial on the bluff, fresh flowers at its base, and in the corner, blurred but unmistakable, a man walking away. Broad-shouldered, heavy frame. Bennett stared at it, breath shallow. Carnes was dead. She'd watched him bleed out on a safe house floor. But the image, blurry, grainy, seemed to taunt her. Was it a ghost, a double, or proof that the network still lived? She folded the photograph carefully, sliding it back into the envelope. And then, for the first time in years, she smiled. Not with relief, but with grim resolve. Because the story wasn't over, and as long as she drew breath, she would keep hunting.